Anyway, today I want to back up to the New Testament itself, because we're going to look at a body of writings here, a collection of writings by a collection of people, and try to understand what's going on in them, and trying to understand what the overall theme of the various writers is. So we'll look at the development of the New Testament itself. The body of writings we have developed over a period of time, but what was that period of time? When? Jesus himself wrote nothing, just as Confucius wrote nothing. A variety of people who have originated religious and philosophical movements, Socrates, for example, wrote nothing down. It was their followers who wrote things down. The same is true of Jesus. But we do have accounts that were written during the lifespans of first-hand eyewitnesses. Now, whether any of the documents in the New Testament were actually written by eyewitnesses is controversial, but they were certainly written under the influence of such people and with such people all around. Now, a lot of the documents in the New Testament we can't date very precisely, but one of them we can. Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, the first one, was written in 51 AD. We know that on the basis of numismatic evidence, coins that refer to people Paul refers to in that letter as being in certain positions of power, and they were there for only 1 year. And we can identify that year on the basis of coins. So we know that First Thessalonians was written in 51, and it's considered the earliest of Paul's letters. So Paul's letters were written during primarily the 50s. He is thought to have died in the early 60s. So presumably most of his letters were written during the 50s. Now, if we try to look at his letters or at the gospel accounts for accounts of Jesus's life, we don't really know that much about it. There are very large gaps. We have a story of his birth and the immediate aftermath of that. Then we have a story when he's 12 years old, and then his baptism at roughly age 30. So we get very little in between, little about the childhood between, say, 1 and 12, and very little between 12 and 30. So there's not much to go on there. Mark describes Jesus as a carpenter. Another gospel describes him as the son of a carpenter. Wouldn't have been unusual for trades to be passed from father to son, so those are not at all incompatible. Well, the first 4 books of the New Testament, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, describe Jesus's life, and the first 3 do it in a kind of narrative fashion, telling a story more or less in temporal order. John seems to have a philosophical purpose and doesn't really do that. It arranges things more thematically, but it is somewhat unclear exactly when certain things happened, or even in what order. Now, let's start with something simple, like when was Jesus born? The traditional date is December 25th, I guess 1 BC. There's no year 0. And yet even that is a little confusing. One gospel account in Matthew says that it was near the reign of Herod the Great, who died in 4 BC. So many scholars think that Jesus probably was born in what we now consider 4 BC. But Herod the Great was succeeded by another Herod, so there's some possibility of confusion there. Another gospel, Luke, puts Jesus's birth at the time of the first enrollment or census. That's why the family travels to Bethlehem when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And Syria then included the area of Judea, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, etc. Quirinius became governor in 6 AD. So there's a 10-year gap between the death of Herod and Quirinius. And some people have said that there's an inconsistency there. But we have to remember that a census was something that took years in the ancient world. It wasn't like today, where people send census takers out and it's all done for the entire nation in a few months. There were distances to travel was slow, and we have records of ancient censuses taking a decade or more. So actually, it's not shocking that this might have happened during the census, a census that later became identified with Quirinius because it finally finished then. So I think all of this is quite inconclusive. We do know a few other things from gospel accounts, from Tacitus and some other sources, that Jesus was put to death by Pontius Pilate. Pilate ruled Judea from 26 to 36. There was a time when German scholars in particular thought that Pilate never existed. But we now have clear evidence from inscriptions and so on that he did. And even when he ruled from 26 to 36, Tacitus describes him as having been removed, fired basically, because he was excessively cruel, which is all too believable reading the gospel accounts. If Jesus began his ministry when he was 30, and that lasted 3 years, presumably then his baptism might have taken place between 28, 29, possibly 30 AD. And if we look at reports of the Star of Bethlehem or something like what that is described as happened in the sky, together with the eclipse described at the crucifixion, that suggests that Jesus might have been executed in April of 30 or 33, which would mean the traditional birth date is about right. Well, enough of this quibbling about details, but I want to indicate sort of where Jesus of Nazareth belongs in our story, so that in part we can see then how to understand and date the subsequent books in the New Testament. Contemporary scholars usually think of the Gospels, the synoptic ones anyway, as having 4 sources. Mark is thought to be Peter's assistant. And so whether Mark himself wrote it or someone else wrote it, ascribing it to him and close to him, in any case, we seem to have a large input from Mark and Peter there. M is thought to be a source for items unique to Matthew. Now, in saying a source, I think it's important not to think of this as unique. It may be that there's a combination of some earlier written accounts, oral accounts, and so on. But Matthew seems to have additional information that he supplies on top of the information in Mark. There is also an independent source for items in Luke. Matthew and Luke overlap, including the content of Mark, but also including some other material that's in that intersection, that overlap, but is not in Mark. And so scholars refer to that as Q. That simply stands for source, and it just means, well, other stuff, something else that apparently Matthew and Luke had access to, but Mark did not. And again, that could be not just one source, it could be written sources in Greek or in Aramaic, it could be people's notes, letters, it could be oral accounts. Well, when were the Gospels written? Traditionally, that is to say, according to the early church fathers, historians of the church in very early centuries like Eusebius, they were written before Paul's letters. They were written during the 40s. And so somewhere in the gap between, say, somewhere roughly a decade or a little more than that after Jesus' death. And according to that account, they came in the order you find them in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John. Though there's some disagreement about that. Modern scholars think the Gospels were written after Paul's letters, though. And so most think that it was the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 that gave rise to the writing of Mark's Gospel. Maybe Mark was written a little bit before that. Many people think it was written during the 60s as the crisis developed, the conflict with Rome. But others think that it was just after. And the common view is that Matthew then was written around 80 and Luke around 90, using Mark as a source. John's Gospel, sometime between 90 and 110. On the other hand, having looked at a fair amount of this literature, a lot of these reasons seem to me pretty inconclusive. For example, an argument that these were written after the destruction of the temple in 70 is that they include a prediction from Jesus that the temple would be destroyed. And the thought is you wouldn't put that in the book unless it had already happened and you were sure that prediction had come true. I don't find that terribly convincing. These were written by people who were willing to die for their beliefs, and in particular, their belief that Jesus was the Son of God. So that they wouldn't have taken a risk writing down a prophecy, especially one that didn't have a timetable attached to it and that could have meant any time in the future. It seems to me weak reason for thinking it must have been written after 70. There are a few other arguments as well, but they seem to me similarly inconclusive. So I consider it something of an open question whether the traditional accounts that they came before Paul's letters or this modern account where they came after is correct. But in any event, I think it's important to put them in an overall timeline of the first century, which I've got here. And so I put some important events on the Roman Empire in blue on the top of the timeline, and then various things in the gospel account below. Jesus dies right around the time that Caligula becomes emperor. And the gospels traditionally would have been written around the time that Caligula is removed and Claudius becomes emperor. And so it's when Claudius is emperor that the Council of Jerusalem takes place. Then Nero takes over, and that becomes kind of a disaster. And that's during the era in which Paul is writing his letters. So the fall of the temple, and then on the modern account, the Gospels are written down a bit after that. Here's the thing I wanted to point out here. How long was it between Jesus's crucifixion and the writing of the Gospels or various other things in the New Testament? Well, in the traditional conception, it's only a gap of about 10 years or a little more. 10 years ago, that was 2012. And so I've listed here some important events from that year. And then the movie that won the Academy Award for Best Picture, plus a variety of songs. Anyway, you can see, at least to me, it feels like that wasn't long ago at all. Now, I realize you being younger might think, oh gosh, Obama reelected, songs like Call Me Maybe or We Are Young, Gangnam Style, that may feel like a long time ago to you. It doesn't feel that long to me. Anyway, the point is, there's still tons of people alive who remember all of that. First Thessalonians, we know pretty precisely to be about 18 years after Jesus' death. Well, that would be like 2004, Bush's reelection, or the development for the first time of Facebook and Gmail, or songs like Hey Ya. The point of this little exercise, which just amused me for about an hour on Saturday afternoon, was really just to say there were many people who were eyewitnesses to the event, still alive when all of these things were being written. So whether or not they were written by eyewitnesses themselves, these were not legends of remote events that had happened generations ago. These were things that had happened within the lifetime of many of the people in the audience. And so Paul at one point says, you know, there are more than 500 people who actually saw Jesus after his supposed death, who actually saw him resurrected. And he said some have died, but hey, you can go talk to them. There are lots of people around who have witnessed things. Anyway, I think it is important to realize that at the time these documents were written, there were still many eyewitnesses alive. The synoptic gospels describe the outline of Jesus's ministry in more or less the following way. They start with perhaps a birth narrative, then his baptism by John the Baptist. You get the calling of the disciples, then performing a variety of miracles, the parables that illustrate various points to the disciples, and then an account of the Sermon on the Mount. Luke calls it the Sermon on the Plain. Then you get the entry into Jerusalem, a triumphant entry on Palm Sunday, the Last Supper, the trial, the crucifixion, and then Jesus' resurrection. So all of the synoptic gospels have those elements. They then add in certain details to those, but that's the basic structure of the story in each of them. Mark ends in a particularly dramatic way, I think. The women find the tomb empty, and they run away in fear, telling nobody. That appears to be the original ending. Later, it seems, a shorter ending and then a longer ending were added. And usually in contemporary Bibles, those are marked as the shorter ending, the longer ending, and maybe a note that says these appear to have been added later. Our earliest manuscripts of Mark do not include them. Mark does seem to be a genre of sudden surprise endings. And that's what this is. I think in a literary way, it's actually really gripping. The women are terrified. They don't know what to make of it. They run away. That's one puzzle that scholars have looked at. Like, why does it end that way? There are other puzzles. Why do the disciples often seem baffled by Jesus' parables? They seem not to understand them. There's another puzzle that scholars debate in Mark. Mark stresses the messianic secret. Jesus tells the disciples, not to tell people who he is. And so for a long time, he says, yeah, look, who am I? And they know. He says, don't tell anybody else. And he tells some people he cures not to spread the word. Now, invariably, they do anyway. They don't listen to him. But why does he tell them that? Why does he keep it a secret for so long? So both of those, I think, are interesting questions. Let's start with the first one. Why do the disciples often seem puzzled by Jesus' parables? Do you have any insight into that?
It's almost like a literary device, where as the readers, we're supposed to be kind of clued in to what Jesus is actually talking about. And it's, I don't know, like a literary foil just to make the story kind of work the way he wants it to.
That is certainly one possibility, that basically you've got to get the story out. And it's a bit like Socrates in a Platonic dialogue, where you need some other people who say, I don't understand Socrates. And so Socrates can explain further. That is pretty common in ancient dialogues. So that's a plausible hypothesis. Any other ideas? My only thought is that when I was young, I thought I understood all these parables, and I was a little baffled. Like, come on, you guys know him. Why are you baffled? I get it, and I'm only 12 years old or whatever. Now that I'm older, I admit I often see things in these parables that I didn't see at the time when I was younger. So now I, too, sometimes come away puzzled, thinking, wait, I'm not sure I understand. And so anyway, I think the literary explanation is plausible. It may be plausible that also he's largely talking to people who are fishermen. They haven't thought much about this, and they're puzzled by the metaphorical nature of the stories. But I think there's another aspect, which is that they may see a depth in it, or at least in some of the parables, that yes, there's an obvious moral of the story, but maybe there's sometimes deeper questions that arise, and they knew enough to be puzzled about some of those deeper questions. In any case, I think that's not that deep a puzzle. There are various plausible explanations. But what about the messianic secret? That might seem more puzzling. Why doesn't Jesus reveal who he is at the outset? Why does he keep that hidden for so long?
Isn't it possible that there's like a kind of political implications with him not wanting to like let it be known that he's the Messiah, because that would bring a lot of attention to him from like the Jewish religious leaders, but also like the Roman kind of hierarchy.
Well, exactly. I got to admit, I don't find this that puzzling. And I find it baffling in some ways that scholars are puzzled, precisely because of what you said. Look what happens to him once that claim becomes known to the authorities. The Pharisees and the Sanhedrin oppose him. He gets in trouble with the Romans. It leads to his death. It seems to me there are pretty good reasons to wait to reveal that until you've managed to convince enough people that what you're saying is true. So I don't find this that baffling.
Why do you think the other synoptic gospels don't include that detail?
Yeah, that's a good question. If it's true that Mark has a source, or is a source, very close to Peter, it may be that Peter knew this and knew about Jesus telling the disciples not to reveal the secret, but the sources of Matthew and Luke didn't have that information. Now, given that Matthew and Luke appear to have had Mark as a source, though, on the other hand, they had access to it, at least in that form. So does that mean that their sources didn't remember anything like that? Is it that they thought that was a little bit too easy to manipulate into a claim that, see, Jesus himself was denying that he was the Son of God? I'm not sure. A number of scholars have pointed to this as a kind of claim that Jesus didn't claim to be the Son of God, and that only later did people try to foist divinity on someone who made no such claim at the time. And they may have been aware already at that time that there were people saying this, that, oh, you're just saying that. He never said that. And they may have thought, I don't want to put this in because maybe that will reinforce their attitude. But I don't have a clear idea of why. And I think there are a number of proposals for this which aren't entirely convincing. Does anybody else have any ideas why Other gospel writers would have left that out.
I mean, it almost seems kind of counterintuitive. Like the go and make fishers of men, but don't tell anyone that, like, I am the Son of God. Like, that seems like those are pulling in opposite directions for the disciples.
That's right. That's right. It is. They are pulling in opposite directions. One possibility is that he is going to send the disciples out and make them fishers of men, but he wants to make sure they're ready, and he doesn't think they're ready. And so he tells them to keep the secret from that point of view, because he thinks, look, you're still apprentices. You're not ready yet. And if you go out there trying to fish, you're going to get us all killed. So I want to keep this tight-knit until I'm sure you're prepared. Kind of like the teacher who doesn't want the student to go out and actually apply for the job or, do things on their own until they're fully ready. And so maybe something like that is going on, because eventually he does want them to go out and spread the word that he is the Son of God. And so it can't be a permanent thing. It's got to be a for now, don't tell people who I am, if it's to make any sense at all. Otherwise, that contradiction that you're pointing out is pretty severe.